Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Supradeep Das and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I welcome you to today's Wednesday seminar, Beyond Idealism, Making Sense of India's Advocacy for the PRC's Security Council seat in the 1950s. I am delighted to welcome you to today's seminar. Today's seminar will take up a question that has long puzzled scholars of Indian foreign policy. Why did India in the 1950s support the People's Republic of China's claim to permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council at a time when bilateral tensions were already beginning to the surface? Moving beyond the familiar explanation of Nehruvian idealism, the speaker will revisit historical records and scholarly debates to offer a more nuanced interpretation. The argument suggests that India's position was grounded not merely in moral principle, but in a deeper social understanding of international relations, particularly the lessons drawn from early 20th century about the dangers of excluding materially significantly powers from the global institutions. By situating India's stance within this broader historical and theoretical framework, today's seminar invites us to rethink the strategic logic which is underpinning India's approach to China and the evolving post war international order. The speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Nabarun Roy, who is currently an assistant professor at the Department of International Relations, South Asian University, New Delhi. His research interest lies in theories of international relations, Indian foreign policy, great power politics, and wars in international relations. He has also contributed to journals like the International History Review, Diplomacy and Statecraft, Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs, India Review, India Quarterly, and Studies in Indian Politics. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Atul Bharadwaj, who is an academic and strategic affairs analyst currently affiliated with the School of Policy and Global Affairs University at City University of London. His research explores into the intersection of geopolitics, maritime strategy, and shifting connectivity paradigms. He was also a Prime Minister Museum and Library Fellow in New Delhi. He has authored a book called India-America Relations 1942 to 62, rooted in the liberal international order, published by Routledge in 2019, and has been a regular contributor to the strategic affairs column of the Economic and Political Weekly since 2013. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may also use raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Bharadwaj. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Roy. We look forward to listening to this very, important aspect of our international history. I won't intervene now at this stage. I would listen to you, and I would, try to imbibe whatever you're saying, and then probably we'll get into the question, answer, and discussion, aspects of it. So over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for turning up for this talk. I look forward to sort of making your next 1 hour or so worth it. So what I'll do is that I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just use it to share it on the screen. So please let me know if it is visible to everyone. Just give me a second, please. Is it visible to everyone on the other side?
Yes, it's visible.
All right, great. So I'll get started, and I think I've been told about roughly 40 minutes or so is what I would be getting. So I'll try my level best to stick within the time limit. So the title of the talk is Beyond Idealism, Making Sense of India's Advocacy for People's Republic of China's Security Council seat in the 1950s. So let me just first of all give you the sort of, the very big context within which we can situate today's discussion. One, of course, is the fact that at one level, we will be talking about the permanent membership of the Security Council of the United Nations, which is generally agreed amongst most people to be a marker of status, power, and prestige in international relations, and therefore the attempt on the part of quite a few countries, especially in contemporary times, to actually get a permanent, sort of seat at the Security Council. Membership of the Security Council also is seen as playing a part in enhancing a state's standing as a great power. So, for instance, some would argue the fact that, when you talk about certain countries which were probably pivotal in international relations 100 years ago, today, when they have slipped from that status, their membership as of the Security Council as a permanent member has still allowed them to retain great deal of influence, even though their material capabilities might have slipped quite a few notches. So that is the salience of the permanent membership. And also the fact that over the last few decades, I would say around 2 decades or so, there has been a concerted effort on the part of India to stake its claim and convince the international community of the suitability of its candidature as a permanent member of the Security Council. So that's basically the broad context within which we can look at today's discussion. Now, what is the puzzle that I'm going to try to sort of address? The puzzle is that many of us would be aware through media reports or in different platforms, the fact that people point out that there were certain offers that were made to India, specifically to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, in the 1950s for taking up a permanent member seat at the Security Council, which thereafter was in some senses rejected, or maybe a milder formulation would be that India did not show much interest to those quote unquote offers. So that is one sort of puzzling thing, given the fact that today India is trying really hard to, again, sort of, get a seat at that particular table. The second interesting thing, which is related to this itself, is that not only did India say no, but it also advocated for Communist China's membership at the Security Council during the same period of time. Now, that is rather interesting because for those of us who know a little bit about Indian foreign policy, India's security scenario, we know that as the 1950s progressed, India-China relations became increasingly strained, and we all know that that leads up to the 1962 war. So at a time when things started looking a little, sort of unstable on the India-China front, India kept up its commitment for advocating China's rightful place at the Security Council as a permanent member. The question is why? Why this rather puzzling behavior on the part of India during those times? Now, as a student of international relations, one of the first things that we obviously try to do is to look for explanations. Why did that happen? And I would argue that there's been very limited theoretical explanation. Now, as a student of international relations, I'm quite interested in theories of international relations. And I do think that, theory should be able to help us understand why something was done or is being done. To that extent, I would argue that there has been very little theoretical explanation. And generally speaking, it has been convenient on the part of most people to attribute it to Nehruvian idealism. That Nehru was idealistic, and therefore it's not surprising that he ended up doing what he did with reference to the Security Council offer. I basically want to look closer at that and try a little bit more to get something more out of this in terms of an explanation rather than just attribute it to this idea of idealism. So, what's the agenda for today's talk of mine? First of all, I would like to highlight and detail some of these offers that were made to India. So, who made these offers? When were these made? And generally speaking, what were the terms of these offers? Also, what explanations have been offered for India's rather peculiar stand? Why did India look the other way? I contribute to this to the explanation part of it by banking on a particular approach or a theoretical approach in international relations scholarship, which is sometimes referred to as the international society perspective. And I try to engage with that particular theoretical dimension in order to make sense of India's and Nehru's particular stand on the issue. And I promise you I'll not make it too theoretical because I will be using certain basic building blocks of the international society perspective and trying to use them in order to hopefully make some sense as to why India did what it had done. All right. So one of the things that sort of, jumps, at us in recent times is the fact that in light of the Pulwama blast in 2019, February, um, a few years ago, the role of the Jaish-e-Mohammed basically became fairly pronounced in the eyes of the Indian security establishment. And there was a bid to have Maulana Masood Azhar listed as a global terrorist by India. Now, one of the things that happened was that there was a technical hold by People's Republic of China. I'll use the term China rather than use the longer formulation. So there was a technical hold which was put by China, and subsequently the government of India was criticized for its handling of China by the opposition parties, specifically the Congress. Now, at that point of time, Arun Jaitley basically hit back and basically pointed the finger back at the opposition, basically saying that, well, it was Prime Minister Nehru who should be seen as the original sinner when it comes to India's sort of, lack of probably success when it dealing with China on certain specific issues. And it was pointed out, and we were reminded that during his tenure, People's Republic of China had been favored over India, and that India had in fact supported China's bid for a permanent seat. It was also pointed out, and we were reminded, that there were certain informal suggestions that had been made to Nehru by the United States, and this had been declined. Nehru refused to bite it. In fact, it is claimed that Nehru feared that there would be a fallout with China, and that any step in that direction of taking up a seat at the cost of China would be unfair for a great country like China. So that is generally what is fairly well known. And I think every few months or so, you will have some sort of piece in the media reminding us of this sort of original sin. Now, what are these specific offers that one can glean? What are the things that we can know for sure? Well, based on the different sort of material that I have come across, in August 1950, for instance, it is sort of reported that US State Department officials did make some sort of an approach, which is considered to be informal. This approach was not made at the very highest of levels. However, the nature of the sort of, the approach seemed to indicate that there was an element of sincerity underlying the American officials' outreach to India. And the basic offer was to unseat communist China and have India instead take its place. This can be seen as the replacement formula. Shashi Tharoor's book, Nehru, the Invention of India, makes the same point. Makes the same point along these lines, but basically he points out that this was made in 1953. So therefore, one wonders whether this was a follow-up to the 1950 offer, or was it something which was slightly different? So one is not sure about that, but there is an element of continuity. Jane Dixit, in his book, India's Foreign Policy, basically points out that some sort of an offer along these lines was made again in the mid-1950s. Now, the Soviets were also part of this process. So Bulganin makes some sort of an offer in 1955, and he basically says that perhaps India could become a sixth member of the United Nations Security Council, although he seems to suggest that this could probably happen at some later stage. Now, this, of course, is a slightly different from the American so-called offer or proposal, because it is to add India on to whoever is already there existing. Now, former UN Secretary General Trygve Lie basically says, also is seen as having commented that the number of members of the Security Council should be increased, and that India had to be seriously considered in this regard. Now, generally speaking, what are the implications of these offers? As I've already pointed out, one was, of course, the replacement formula, which would mean that, whoever was sitting, India would be replacing that particular entity. And the second one would be where India would be a sixth sort of member of the Security Council. So these were the two slight different formulations. Now, what was India's reaction? Now, Nehru is reported to have viewed the US offer as something that can definitely create trouble between us and China. And this has been fairly well reported. In a letter that was written to Vijayalakshmi Pandit, he basically writes that it would be a clear affront to China and that it would also constitute or probably lead to some kind of a break between us and China. He also mentions that China had to take her rightful place at the United Nations. He goes on to say further that minus China, people would lose faith in the United Nations, that the USSR would leave the UN, and this would probably also mean the end of the United Nations, which would again further cause the drift towards war. And I'll come back to this theme of Nehru and war later in the presentation. It was also pointed out that this offer in some ways entailed UN Charter revision, and it would be difficult given the politics of those times. Trygve Lie, for instance, he later on, in the context of the same sort of idea, basically says that would including India be a practical policy? On the other hand, A.J. Noorani basically believes that this sort of US offer was more of a feeler. And he argues that Nehru was in fact wise in not following it up. So, for instance, he says that, in light of the offer, would, for instance, the USSR agree to the US proposal at a time, especially when USSR PRC relations were in full swing? So basically, Noorani shows that, this was more of a trap and that Nehru and India was wise basically in not falling for it. Now, the other sort of, interesting aspect to this story is the fact that not only did India say no to whatever type of offers were made, but in fact, India went the extra yard and seemed to support Communist China's sort of, membership at the Security Council. So, for instance, in August 1950 in Parliament, Nehru seems to sort of, remind and espouse Communist China's sort of, Security Council seat. In 1952, he is he's writing that the PRC was a well-established fact, and in fact that the Security Council was undermined by keeping Communist China out of it. In 1954, Nehru basically in Parliament again says that it was a real unrealistic state of affairs to keep PRC out, and that for him, facts as they existed in international relations were simply not being acknowledged. We fast forward in a way to 1960 in London. He again basically says that it is absurd to again not have Communist China sitting at the UN. And he also observes that the issue in international relations could not be addressed if the biggest and most populous country was not part of the UN. So basically, how could the United Nations, come and resolve various tricky situations if a very pivotal member of the international system was simply not a part of it? So he also basically seemed to argue that many problems would become much simpler if the PRC was included within the larger UN system. Furthermore, we are aware of the fact that Nehru also tried to put across his ideas to other world leaders. So, for instance, in May 1950, he asked the British leader, Ernest Bevin, to somehow, help PRC get into the United Nations Security Council and also other UN organs, since delay would really harm the United Nations solidarity and also it would be bad for world peace. In June 1950, he requested the Egyptian PM to back the PRC's case because, again, this would really give a boost to the United Nations and for the cause of world peace. In 1950, he communicates to the Burmese leader, UNU, that he had brought to the attention of Stalin and to the American Dean Acheson to to sort of, look seriously into admitting PRC into the United Nations Security Council. He also, however, was fairly clear that making this sort of case for the PRC's admission to the Security Council did not really mean endorsing its policies, but it was more of a fact that had to be sort of acknowledged and given its due. He's also seen as sort of writing that a realistic and wise recognition of established and indisputable fact as to who effectively controls China is key to, again, sort of, international relations itself. In 1956, in London, during the 11th and 15th meetings of the prime ministers, again, Nehru sort of voices his support for communist China. In 1960, at the UN General Assembly meeting, India supports the proposal to have the communist China take its place at the Security Council. Okay. So these are some of the basic things that one can sort of gather from the different sort of pieces of scholarship and reporting that exists. Now, one of the things that is clear is the fact that India's espousal for the PRC's cause was fairly long-term and not merely episodic. Some people have tried to make the case that this was India's sort of sympathy for communist China was more in the context of the Korean War, because the Korean War was heading in a very dangerous direction. It was felt that China had to be put within the Security Council in order to stabilize things. Whatever we can gather, it seems that this was more than just one particular episode. It was fairly consistent, and it spanned at least a decade or so, if you look at the existing evidence. The other thing that also appears to me is the fact that this was not something which was very strongly shaped purely by bilateral dynamics. It had other sort of issues built into it. So, for instance, sometimes when we talk about why did India do this, it was more about appeasing China at a time when China started becoming difficult. And I would argue that that is perhaps not the best way to make sense of this particular story. It is also true that in trying to make a case for China's seat at the Security Council, Nehru did invoke ethics, questions of morality, world peace, UN solidarity, etc. And to that extent, all these sort of, invocations, all these terms, it does neatly fit into this sort of, idealist thesis that we are so very well aware of. Also, when IR scholars from a more theoretical lens have looked at this particular sort of, aspect, not necessarily in terms of the puzzle, because I don't think people had really focused on this puzzle earlier too much, but more in terms of Nehru's general sort of conduct towards China. Again, I mean, this sort of IR theorists have basically said that, well, it doesn't really fit in with realism or a more pragmatic approach to world politics. So what else could it be but idealism? Simply because this doesn't make sense, and this can be sort of relegated to this idealist sort of box in as far as thinking on IR is concerned. So what am I sort of trying to do out here? What is my sort of take on this? Again, as somebody who's interested in theories of international relations, I do think that it should be possible for us to go beyond simply talking about idealism and really help in explaining why India did what it had done. So are there concepts, are there certain big ideas that exist in the world of international relations scholarship that can help us in this regard? And I basically argue that the focus should not really be on this question of appeasement or, on a, sort of month-to-month India-China relations and, how things went north or south. But one has to focus more on the category of great powers in international relations, and specifically Nehru's understanding of who the great powers were and what the great powers meant when it came to international relations and also their impact on the system overall. I also argue that this particular issue has to be looked at more through the lens of the concepts of revisionist and status quo powers. That is something that international relations scholars have sort of used a fair amount in making sense of world affairs. And the basic understanding is that whenever you see revisionist powers, there is this sort of penchant to associate revisionist powers with a certain degree of negative impact on order. And order is something that sort of underpins and sort of implicates all of us when it comes to international relations. So that is basically the overall broad sort of canvas that I use in order to make sense of what India's sort of, overall approach was. Now, in order to sort of shine the light on the question of great powers, one basic question is that did India think that communist China was a great power? Because we all know that, when we talk about communist China, it's not the China of today, it's the China of the 1950s. So there is a good sort of reason why people might say that, well, you're applying today's understanding and going back, almost 70 years or so, and trying to attribute great power status to a country which really was much lesser than what it is today. But what do the sort of principal decision makers in India have to say about China during that period of time? So, for instance, in 1950, in Parliament, Nehru says that can anyone deny China at the present moment the right of a great power from the point of view of strength and power to mold events and shape her destiny or round about her? She is a great power, regardless of whether you like it, whether you like or dislike it. So Nehru is fairly clear that, China is not just any other country, it's not just any other power, it is a great power. And what is interesting is that he also invokes this element of strength and power. So it's not, should anyone think that, when Nehru is talking about power or great power, he means it as a moral force, as an ideational force. No, he does say that, no, it is a strong, material power. So that's something that sort of gives us comfort that, his ideas can be mapped onto regular concepts and ideas in international relations. They're not really in a very different universe. Then, of course, one of the sort of premier diplomats of India, KPS Menon, he basically goes on to say that China was accepted as a great power at the end of the Second World War at the UN itself. Nehru in Parliament in 1954 says that excluding Communist China from the Security Council was an unrealistic state of affairs. Facts as they existed were not being acknowledged. So, as one can see, there's a fairly strong sort of sense within some of the principal sort of characters in Indian foreign policy that China was just not any power. It was something that had to be dealt with seriously and carefully. Now, given the fact that we can make the case that, well, China was seen as a great power by the Indian decision makers, what kind of a great power was it? Because again, as we know that, great powers can be of different types. And one of the basic sort of distinctions that we can draw is between status quo and revisionist powers. So it is here that again, we come across certain additional insights of Indian leaders. So it was basically, Nehru basically says that PRC was a strong country with an abnormal state of mind that was very, very far from normality. So it is a strong power, but it is not a normal power. In the Commonwealth Prime Ministers meet in 1960, again, Nehru says that PRC's leaders knew little of the outside world and the language barrier made conveying ideas very difficult. So again, there is an indication that, it is a strong power, but, it does not seem to be operating in a way that you would expect of regular sort of, great powers. He also goes on to say that the PRC was a product of revolution, and all revolutions are a departure from normal behavior, normal development. Such states do not pretend to having drawing room manners. In fact, they go against drawing room manners and break things. They are destructive. He also goes on to say that China had been at the receiving end of insolent treatment from imperialist powers who treated China in a highly unequal manner. And furthermore, he goes on to say that China was a very prickly state which resented any questioning of its newfound strength and self respect. Then, of course, we continue on this particular sort of assessment of what kind of a power China was, according to, again, sort of Indian decision makers. Nehru goes on to say that being outside, UN resolutions had no impact on PRC. And I quote him, is it conceivable that some orders issued by other countries or by the UN are going to be accepted by China as orders? You cannot have it both ways. Ignore China, keep China outside the pale of international society, and then issue orders to China. this sort of sentiment on the part of Nehru seems to be sort of vindicated in some ways by Chow En Lai when he says that the United Nations claims to have no obligation towards us. We also have none to them. And this is something which is reported in a telegram sent by K.M. Panikkar to G.S. Vajpayee. In December 1950, Nehru is observing that the Chinese government and people want to be treated as such, as a great power. Because they've not been treated similarly, they are angry and resentful and are not prepared to talk. Okay, so till now, what have we done? First of all, we have sort of in a way acknowledged the fact that for Indian decision makers, China was a great power, but it was a great power that had, which was not an average great power. It was not a normal great power. It was prickly. It was difficult. It was rather isolated. So these are some of the sort of basic observations that can be made. However, we need to map this observation regarding China in the broader context of what the world looked like to somebody like Nehru during those times. And what he says about the contemporary international system, that is the international system of the late 1940s and the 1950s, is the following. He says that post World War I, the general equilibrium or the balance of power had been dismantled. And over a period of time, bipolarity has emerged. Now, according to him, bipolarity not merely discredits the balance approach, but it makes it ominous and the portent of catastrophe. So again, I mean, whereas some international relations scholars have made the argument that bipolarity was probably the stablest configuration when it comes to great power relations, Nehru had a very different idea, and he saw bipolarity as something which was highly, highly dangerous. He goes on to say that in the world today, we live in some kind of a twilight between peace and war. The old balances have been completely upset, while no new equilibrium has taken their place. He also goes on to say that this sense of unease and discord is not just something that is to be seen between the East and the West, but it is something that is also to be now seen within the West itself. So the idea that we get is that of a highly, highly divided, sort of, increasingly dysfunctional international system. In a letter to Deputy Minister for External Affairs, Nehru in 1954 writes, in Europe, the grand alliance of the Western powers often threatens to break up, though it is strong enough just to hold together at present. The rifts between the UK and the US become increasingly obvious, even more so between the US and France. The conception of a European defense force remains a conception, and there is very little chance of France agreeing to it. So again, I mean, for Nehru, the 1950s are a period when, the international system is simply not behaving in the way that it ideally should have been behaving. Okay. These are some of my basic observations when it comes to Nehru, when he looks at great powers, when he looks at what great powers mean for the international system, and also as to what the international system to him looks like during the time India is advocating for China's sort of, place at the Security Council. Now, one of the things that one needs to appreciate is that for Nehru, the great powers were not isolated competing figures, but history, according to him, had shown that great powers would cooperate frequently, and that this cooperation sometimes would actually provide certain benefits to the overall system. Now, how can this be sort of, really enunciated in a way that helps us to make the argument that therefore for Nehru, China's redemption, China being given its rightful place, was good not only for China, but for the overall system, because that would allow the great powers to have a modicum of civility and functionality between them. So, what can we look at in order to see how seriously Nehru looks at this question of cooperation amongst the great powers and the fact that the great powers should not be pushing each other over the edge or ostracizing them? Now, Nehru basically is someone who, very interestingly, seems to be or was actually in favor of the veto provision. Now, Hans Morgenthau, the noted international relations scholar, basically referred to the veto provision as a constitutional monstrosity. Simply for the fact that it gave a select few powers so much influence and political power as compared to the rest. There were various states during that period of time in the mid 1940s that were seriously against this veto provision for the simple fact that this went against the sovereign equality of states as a principle. Now, it is interesting that for somebody like Nehru, who we know has spoken about the lack of hierarchy, who's talked about justice, curiously, he's actually someone who favors the veto provision. In 1948, Nehru writes that if the veto is removed, the UN would be imperiled. So, for the sake of the UN functioning, it is important that the veto be there. So, he goes on to say that it is not democratic or logical. Nevertheless, it was a practical recognition of the world as it was and as it is. And this he writes in 1960. So he realizes that it's not the best possible thing, but it is a practical thing, and one had to accept that. The veto, according to him, would prevent the secession of some great powers from the United Nations. And to that extent, it would hopefully not allow a repeat of what had happened with reference to the League of Nations, where the United States, for instance, did not see itself being part of it. So you had to have the great powers very much part of the the core of international relations. During his time, Nehru, for instance, makes it known to the Australian High Commissioner that India supports the veto. And he also basically points out that India does not support the weakening of the UN system. And by weakening, he means again revisiting this whole veto question, because that would potentially lead to the exit of some of the great powers, because the great powers had a had a stake in the veto itself. In the context of the Korean War, for instance, Nehru was not comfortable with the Uniting for Peace resolution for the simple fact that, again, the great powers would be bypassed. And according to him, there was a certain way in which business had to be done when it came to international relations, especially in difficult times. 1 second, please. So I have about 5 more minutes. I'll just, yeah. So this is basically the long sort of arc of what Nehru was positioning himself, and therefore India was positioning itself with reference to the question of China's sort of candidature or membership at the as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So how do we make sense of Nehru's logic? So what would be our evaluation? First, again, as a scholar of international relations who's interested in theories, I argue that IR theories have a lot more to offer than simply the realpolitik dimension. So we need to step up beyond it in order to appreciate why India was behaving in this rather anomalous way. And I argue that the international society perspective is a useful perspective in this regard, because in many ways it combines realism, pragmatism with a very social understanding of international relations. So when we look at the way that international relations is conducted, we also realize that it is behaving in a way which makes us believe that it is also some sort of a society. As per this logic, the great powers are very important, but the great powers also are seen to play a managerial role, which gives international relations a central direction. So, to that extent, when we look at how Nehru was approaching the question of communist China and great power relations overall, he also seems to have certain expectations about what the great powers should be doing. So, again, just to be sure, he was not really against the sense of hierarchy that was there. He said that it was not the best of things to happen, but nonetheless, for the international system to function, this had to be the path. And therefore, his very surprising endorsement of the veto provision. In fact, certain scholars such as Hedley Bull in international relations have looked at the great powers and called them an institution, that they are so central and pivotal to the very running of international orders, that great powers are not just separate entities, but they work almost as an institution of international relations. So I would argue that Nehru's thinking on these aspects to some extent mirrors this type of a logic, and therefore simply to sort of confine his ideas to the realm of idealism, because it was not based on self-interest in the way that we understand it, I think does disservice to our own sort of interest in the discipline itself. However, that does not mean that things were, one is justifying what Nehru did or maybe completely agreeing with the way that he was looking at international relations. There are certain questions that definitely remain. For instance, um, one can, at the end of the day, nonetheless be critical of his stand and say that, well, at one level, you're privileging great power relations, which is more macro, as compared to China, which is an immediate neighbor with whom during the 1950s, progressively your relations are getting worse. So surely there has to be at a tipping point where you invert the equation and you start paying more attention to the immediate imperatives as compared to looking at the larger great powers and what they mean for order and what order means for India in turn. So I think that is reasonable criticism or observation one can make regarding Nehru's thinking. The other thing, of course, is the fact that he was someone who was highly sensitive to the competition amongst the great powers in the 1950s, and he himself felt to some extent responsible for sort of putting a few things right. Now, the degree, I mean, obviously, the 1950s were a very turbulent period. The great powers were competing against each other. Their alignments were changing. But again, one can ask the question whether having so much of a stake and taking these dynamics so seriously beyond a point, whether that really was useful. And of course, the third thing that one would consider is the fact that the shadow of a third world war in Nehru's own thinking sometimes I think led him to look at things in a way that would not have really been the best way of looking at things. So, for instance, his idea that things like SEATO or NATO would be these transmitters of localized conflicts onto the entire region, and that is the way that he also, for instance, looked at the Korean War and grew very alarmed. So, although the war was happening in Korea, which was a fair distance removed from India, I mean, the Nehru's reaction in many ways seemed to suggest that the war was much closer home. So, on these counts, I think there is enough scholarship to critique and to raise question marks about whether that was the best way of interpreting events and history. But nonetheless, I mean, this is pretty much how things look. Now, before I conclude, one can also basically just as a random thought experiment say that where has that led us? Has China, for instance, shown appreciation to India's advocacy or the stand it had taken on the question of Security Council membership in the 1950s? What do the present times have to say? And I think those of us who do have a look at what's happening around us note that China has been, I think, the most guarded when it comes to speaking about India's bid for a permanent seat at the Security Council. So whereas the other four permanent members have on occasions supported India's bid, have made encouraging statements and remarks to that extent. China has been very balanced and I think circumspect when it comes to supporting India's bid. Generally speaking, China couches the question of expansion of the Security Council in broader terms, in terms of basic principles, in terms of representation of the developing countries, representation for Africa, etc., and refuses to get drawn into talking about specific countries per se, which obviously does not really help India's cause in some ways. Of course, it is also true that I think at certain points, for instance, recently in China was reported to have said that it understands and respects India's aspirations in the context of a strategic dialogue that happened in Delhi in February in this month. And some people have seen this as somewhat of a positive sign. But again, I mean, once one goes back to some of the statements and observations that China has made regarding India, again, this is not something which is terribly new. So in earlier years also, China has made these similar types of formulations that it understands and supports India's aspirations to play a bigger role at the UN, including in the Security Council. But these are again something that cannot be like pinned very properly. These are sort of qualified, fairly broad in their scope. So there's not much sort of, joy that India can sort of take from China's stand. And now that it is India's sort of, attempt to secure for itself a place at the Security Council. So of course, then one can sort of, revisit that particular episode in history and say that, how wise were people? Was that the best way to go forward? But then again, sometimes as students of history, of international relations, we are reminded that we need to evaluate a position given the reality of those times, and perhaps sort of, making these observations in today's with the benefit of hindsight is always a great luxury. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and and handling this very rather controversial historical topic very carefully and in a very calibrated manner, using your the IR background and IR theories. Why Nehru did what Nehru did. The basic question which comes, when we are discussing this is, were the offers made in any way formal? Did Nehru receive really formal, tangible offers from any quarters of United States, especially for that matter? And since Nehru, when the offer was made for a United Security Council seat, Nehru and other Commonwealth countries, as mentioned as early as October, as early as December 1950, had recognized Communist China. So after having recognized Communist China, there was no question, in fact, of saying that the ROC was the legitimate occupier of the seat at the UN Security Council. So in no way Nehru could have delegitimized the entire thing. Nehru, or for that matter, even Britain, who had recognized China, could not delegitimize that kind of China by saying that it cannot occupy, or China needs to be replaced. So that is one aspect of it. And as far as Nehru's perspective was concerned, obviously he did not want to go in for if one is to look at it from IR theory perspective, one would say that one needs to apply the strategic realism, strategic restraint sort of theory to understand Nehru better. He knew his conditions. There was no way. He had tasted little war with Pakistan in 1948. Where when he asked the United States for weapons, they refused weapons to them. So he was he knew what his situation was. Fiscally, he was poor. Materially, in military material terms, he was poor. When earlier on in 1950, there were some quarters who said that invade Tibet and prevent China from taking over Tibet. The Nehru's generals refused to do that. So Nehru basically, employed strategic restraint. He knew that there was no way that he could fight a war at that stage. Food shortages were there. If we see all those factors in, and that probably shaped Nehru's mind and most of the international relations elite in India's mind. Barring few politicians, most of them. And if one looks at it from that perspective, then also one has to see that, and you mentioned in your talk about the divisions within Europe, especially between Britain and America, on the question of China. So there were these two very, very, there were two views at that particular stage. One was the British view and the other was the American view of China. And we, whatever for reasons, for, Nehru's, not idealism, but strategic restraint, I would say, went in with the British opinion on China. That is to support China's Security Council seat, and that is to recognize China. And the idea behind this was to, and Nehru even advocated including Chow Enlai for the Bandung conference, for that matter. And that factor was basically to bring, to get China into the mainstream free world. and not let it fall, absolutely, lose China to the communist world. So the whole idea behind, and that was the British logic also at that stage when they recognized China. One was, of course, to prevent, the basic aim was to have Hong Kong prevented. And for that, from Mao from taking over Hong Kong, so they wanted to prevent that. That was the main aim, primarily the British aim at that time, in the early in the 50s. And in India followed that, basically trying, and the logic that British offered at that time was that the whole idea of recognizing China or being with China at this stage is that they should not actually start going towards, they should fall absolutely towards into the Soviet camp. So they wanted to exploit the nationalistic tendencies of Mao Zedong, and Nehru was on the same page on this particular issue. So if one looks at it from that particular perspective, then and in the international context, what is happening now? When the question of did America really make a serious offer, and Noorani asked that question, the bedrock of the liberal international order was United Nations. America was using the Security Council seat and the recognition of China as a bargaining chip. As history tells us, the way the trajectory, the whole issue of weaning China away from Soviet Union did not start with Nixon or Kissinger. It had started in early 50s. So, we cannot discount that history, basically, of that strategy employed to do that. So America was constantly putting pressure on China. And one of the issues was how to distance it from the Soviet Union. So in that context, if we see, then we have to see, Nehru changes his policy, but in the mid-50s, when America starts to intervene directly, pressurizing China more on Taiwan and both Tibet issues. So they start pressurizing China, and then you see there is a change in stance within India as well. So from that angle also, if you see from the international context, how international context was shaping Nehru's policies, and the offers that were given to him were in any case, and Nehru's ideas were rooted in liberal international order. There was no idealism in that. What the liberal international order, if we call the liberal international order as idealist, then of course he is an idealist. However, his ideas, and there was no way by destroying the United Nations he would rock that boat. Nor was America, interested in destroying the United Nations at that stage. Removing China and putting in India, shoving in India, would have actually just shattered the entire organization, which the Americans at that stage were not really willing to do that. Were they really willing to do that? One has to ask this question. Because that was the bedrock of the system. Now we say when Trump talks in terms of, he rewrites United Nations, and basically he's rewriting the liberal order that created it. So that is the, how I would understand Nehru's actions, basically, in having China, because Nehru knew deep down that there is no way, even now, after so many years, there is no consensus on making, letting India into the Security Council. So to expect, somebody pushing for India to come into the Security Council in 1950s is unthinkable in that sense. And would Britain have allowed America to take that action? Because Britain was following absolutely different policy. So, in even those questions we have to ask. A lot of our assessment of that Nehru particular period is exclusively based on the statements by the internal actors. I think we need to move beyond, and we need to put it into the international perspective. What was happening internationally? What were the influences on us at that stage? So I would end there and, let others ask you questions. If you have something to refute, please do go.
I don't have something to refute. Actually, I want to add on 2 points which you had highlighted and which I meant to also say, but I somehow missed it. So, with your permission, maybe 1 minute of
Please
just
do,
adding
please
on.
do, please do.
One, you talked about the Bandung conference, and I think that is a perfect sort of illustration of how Nehru was basically trying to, in a way, get China again within the regular sort of, um, sort of trajectory of international politics. Of course, we also know that, international relations, follows the law of unintended consequences. So, whereas he was trying his level best to uh, sort of, get China to know other countries, I think that was seen by the Chinese leaders, by Zhou Enlai, as being very patronizing, as more of a big brotherly attitude, that which actually backfired. So that is another thing that we need to. You also mentioned about the fact that by trying to engage with China, there was also an attempt to appeal to its nationalistic tendencies. Now, also, it is important to remember that when we're talking about Nehru, specifically in the context of the tensions that were brewing in Indochina, Nehru had some very, I think, relevant observations regarding the American approach to events in Indochina, where he said that the Americans are not understanding that the people in that particular part of the world are nationalist, and the Americans they don't appreciate enough the power of nationalism. So to that extent, I think that the recognition of that aspect would have also probably played some role in terms of appealing to the Chinese and getting rehabilitating them, so that things could be a little bit more smooth. Lastly, at the end of the day, I completely endorse your point. The fact that the policies were basically made at a time of severe economic scarcity, and Nehru was very clear that the order of the day was economic development, followed by other things that would follow. So for him, it was not that military power or arming India or taking a more aggressive path was not par for the course. Simply the fact lay that the time was not correct, was not right, the resources were not there. Follow a slightly different policy. So to that extent, the resources probably necessitated the mode of engagement that we were discussing today. Thank you so much.
Well, the floor is open for questions. You can ask the questions now.
I think there are some questions in the comment chat
I
box.
will
So
see that. I'll see that.
We can ask if the people want to make their own question. I mean, they've written it, so
Yeah, they've written it.
so Pradeep reads them out, or if the person who has asked wants to ask it in person.
No, Sudeep,
Yes,
Das can.
yes, sir. So we have the question from Miss Shruti Jagad. She's asking that I'm wondering if this Nehruvian logic can be used to explain other foreign policy decisions in this period. Have you considered any other examples beyond this decision on China?
Okay.
Should
I answer this, or should we take some of these questions and
take
then
2-3 questions?
Just take 3 questions. Yes.
Okay, so the next question is from Mr. Nazar Khan. He is asking that how effective the UN has been since inception. And the next question is from Mr. Akil Ahmed. He is asking that would you argue that India's support for the PRC was less about bilateral India-China relations and more about India's vision of systematic world order building?
should I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Regarding the first question, regarding does Nehruvian logic only work in relation to this particular issue, or can it also be seen at being at work on other fronts? Now, again, I mean, nothing really jumps up in terms of a specific instance, but my sort of, having spent quite some time looking at Nehru's foreign policy quite a few years ago, I am fairly confident that, this type of a approach to the questions of international relations informed his other sort of, his approach to other issues also. So, for instance, the salience of great powers, the need for sort of greater collaboration and cooperation amongst the different entities, the absolute imperative to avert wars, and therefore to insert India into situations which some people would argue India had no business being in, were in many ways sort of, manifestation of some central sort of, pillars as far as Nehru's thinking was concerned. So I'm sorry that I can't recall any specific instance to sort of, confirm this, but I am very sure that this sort of a logic held true for many other sort of, aspects of Indian foreign policy also. Regarding the question, how effective has the UN been? Look, I mean, it's such a big question, and there are so many sort of, angles to it. At one level, given the complexity of international relations, I think um, it's a thankless sort of a situation to be in, to be sort of managing the entire sort of, global order. And you will have successes, you would have failures. There have been people who basically made the argument that, well, imagine for a moment a world without the UN. So when we think of matters of high politics, we think of the veto. Sure, the UN has been far less effective than what its designers had envisioned. But when it comes to issues of, sort of keeping the peace, sort of delivering necessities, resources to people who really need it, the US has been absolutely central to it. So I think it also depends on the issue areas that one would like to focus on. But we do know that when it comes to matters of high politics, when it comes to great power politics, the UN, I would say, has been less than sort of successful in that regard. But I think that comes with the territory itself. But that does not mean that the UN has not been relevant. I think it has been. Um, and the third question, sorry, if one, I'll just have a look at it myself. I've written down the third question. Um, okay, I think this is Akhil's question. Would you argue that India's support for the PRC was less about bilateral India-China relations and more about India's vision of systemic world order building? I mean, look, I mean, the way that I have spoken today, obviously, I have sort of, situated India's sort of attitude towards China, stand towards China on a macro perspective. But to say that, was it less about China itself and more about larger things? No, because I mean, one of the things that is a standout aspect of Nehru's thinking is the fact that, the global and the local in many ways are intertwined. And when he was thinking of, sort of China working in a frictionless manner along with its colleagues at the Security Council, he was in essence thinking about the implications for India and its immediate vicinity. So you cannot then make the argument that because we are talking about the UN Security Council, we are talking about, very rarefied politics, that somehow we can take the ball away from India-China relations. Because in many ways for Nehru, his priority was to ensure that India had an environment, a context within which it could actualize and realize its potential. And for that, keeping the peace was important. To that extent, India-China relation, India's relation with any of the other neighbors was significant. And that can only be assured once you have an overall ecosystem that is more harmonious. So I wouldn't really say that it was simply about global order building. Yes, global order building, but with what purpose? So that it feeds back into the very context within which India was trying to sort of make a sort of case for itself as a successful democratic sort of modern nation. So these are the three questions that were, I think, asked by Supradeep. I think.
We'll move to the
Yes.
next set of questions.
Yeah, so the next question is again from Ms. Shruti Jargan. She is asking that while taking into account Nehru's prominent position in deciding India's foreign policy, is there any other theoretical explanation which doesn't take state as a unitary entity and would take into consideration impact of India's domestic factors, maybe parliamentary position or other leaders' position on the Indian stance?
Okay.
And the next question is from Ms. Mahua Chakrabarti. She is asking that could India's decision to support China's UNSC seat in the 1950s be interpreted as an attempt to preempt Western dominance in Asia, positioning itself as a moral counterweight, even at the cost of its own immediate power ambitions?
Right.
The next question is from Mr. Ravi Bhutalingam. He is asking that even without considering Nehru's idealism or any Ayat theories, did India's decision on China's Security Council seat not follow as a logical consequence of India's earlier recognition of the PRC as the effective government of China and hence the legal occupant of China's SC seat?
Okay. Do you want me to
Please
answer?
answer. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Um, Okay, regarding the question of, not looking at the state as a unitary actor, but more in terms of domestic factors, parliamentary position, or any other leader's position on the Indian stand. So I presume that this question is specifically with relation to India's stand on China and not in a general sense. Would domestic factors, feed into this possible thing, into this explanation? Trying to think of, I mean, how domestic factors would have specifically in my research sort of, appeared into the sort of, thinking and stance taken by India. Um, I mean, at one level, I mean, one must say that, I mean, Nehru was so attentive to sort of, international affairs. He had, great liking for international affairs that in many points of time, I think the tendency on the part of the analyst is also to ascribe a fair amount of weightage to that particular domain. I would have to frankly think a little bit more on this particular aspect about domestic factors and whether that also fed into it. But nothing immediately jumps as a very sound thing. But I'll have to think about it, frankly. Um, as could India's decision to support China's UNSC seat in 50s be interpreted as an attempt to preempt Western dominance, as an into Western dominance in Asia, positioning itself as a moral counterweight, even at the cost of it? Um, I mean, I think at one level, given the, sort of the image that many of us have of Nehru as being very sort of, suspicious of Western sort of in advances. For instance, look at the Seattle episode, where India basically took a fairly activist role in terms of denying Seattle what it could have become. There is this thing of, fighting back against the West, especially against Western security institutions. So to that extent, I think there is an element of that built into it. But I would believe that sort of making the case for China's seat at the Security Council had to do with broader sort of questions also about just the stability of the international order. And once it is done, then various other things such as this whole thing about push by the West, etc., I think could be kept within a certain sort of framework. So that is how I would see it. And regarding the question that, even without considering Nehru's idealism or any higher theories, did India's decision on China's Security Council seat not follow logical consequence of India's earlier recognition of the PRC as the effective government of China and hence the legal occupant of China's Security Council seat? Yes, I mean, I don't think, I mean, there would be a contradiction in that sense. I mean, if one wants to simply follow that particular route, saying that, because India saw the People's Republic of China as the rightful sort of entity, and therefore it had also to sort of be given that position, I think that would be a fair assessment, except that there is quite a bit also that comes across within our purview of other arguments that have been used in terms of stability of the system, about the Cold War and how that could sort of turn into a hot war if dissatisfied powers were not sort of placated and given their positions. So yes, that part of the argument holds, but I would also say that there is enough evidence to show that the external realm, the sort of that component also was feeding into India's sort of stance on that particular issue.
Any other questions?
Yes, so we have 3 more questions lined up.
Please.
So the next question is from Mr. Shriyans Mohanty. He's asking that in June 1950, Nehru sent a cable to the Egyptian Prime Minister urging support for the PRC's admission to the UN. He made similar appeals to the British Foreign Secretary Ernst Bevin, Burmese leader Thakin Mu, and US Secretary of State Dean Acheson. This is contrary to the cynical opportunism of today's geopolitics, where powers would rather exploit China's vulnerabilities instead of affirming its legitimacy as swiftly as history once demanded. How do you see this? And the next question is from Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay. He is asking that what was domestic opposition's perspective on China at that time, and looking at what happened from an option theory perspective, did Nehru or India think that this was a one-off decision, or did they expect that India would join at an appropriate time in the future? And the next question is from Mr. Nazar Khan. He is asking that how sacrosanct is the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and what about all members of the G20?
Thank you. Sorry. So regarding the first question, where this is contrary to the cynical opportunism of today's geopolitics, where powers would rather exploit China's vulnerabilities instead of affirming its legitimacy as swiftly as history once demanded? How do you see this? I mean, yes, I mean, of course, I mean, the way that India positioned itself and made the case that China should have the seat is in some ways contrary to the regular expectations where countries take advantage of someone else's position, especially a country that held so much potential even at that point of time, such as communist China. So to that extent, yes, I mean, this was rather unusual. And that's the reason why I think this has become such a sort of interesting and controversial topic in the first place. That I mean, it would have been far easier to taken a position that, well, if that is the case, then why don't we forward our claims, since already there are certain feelers coming. So to that extent, I think opportunity, many would argue that this, what you're terming as cynical opportunism, is pretty much the default setting when it comes to international politics. Domestic, I think opposition, obviously, there were critics of Nehru when it came to China. And we know that right from the time that, China enters Tibet, there were Nehru's colleagues who were very, very clear about the fact that India had to deal with the situation in a different manner. The fact that, India had to look at the realpolitik means a lot more. So to that extent, I think on China itself, there exists quite a bit in terms of the fact that, although Nehru was dominant in his ability to influence Indian foreign policy, there were strong voices within the country who questioned the the wisdom of India's particular stance on China overall, be it on the question of what to do with Tibet or many other such issues. So I think to that extent, I mean, it was not a one-sided story. Looking at what happened from an option theory perspective, did Nehru India think this was a one-off decision, or did they think India? I mean, Nehru did mention in his correspondences that, well, our time will come. We also, given the fact that, we are a fairly different type of power, civilizational sort of trajectory, the population, what we stand for, we also should be having such a thing. But for him, it was more a question of sequencing that, what is an established fact needs to be acknowledged. And I think India's turn will come. So it is something that was on his mind, but I don't think, given the times that he was operating in, that it was something that had to happen immediately. So I think to that extent, it was there, but not immediately. How sacrosanct is 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? Look, I mean, that is a matter of debate, because today people are saying that, why should we even invest so much energy and effort into getting a membership into the Security Council when there are probably smaller entities that are specializing in certain things? So is it better for India or any other country to seek membership in those particular bodies rather than spend so much time on the P5? I mean, I think it's an open debate.
Forget Security Council. People are talking in terms of the United Nations, whether it is relevant or not itself.
Yeah.
So Alka, you wanted to come in, please.
Okay, thanks. I think we have a little bit of time. Just a few thoughts that came to me, not so much in questions, but simply in terms of broadening what has been clearly a very fascinating presentation, and obviously the remarks from the chair. And you can see from the questions, everybody is like, really teasing out more and more of aspects out of here. So I think there are 3 kind of broad issues that come together in your presentation. While your focus has been on Nehru's, the factors behind Nehru's decision to support the PRC's bid for its permanent membership. Now, see, one is, of course, the element that Atul had brought in, which is that what really inspired the recognition also. Okay, so this is really 2 things coming together. And the fact that the liberal international perspective seems to answer this question is clearly more persuasive. Because if we look at what is happening in the United States at that time, I mean, that whole who lost China debate, the McCarthyism that had been unleashed, the whole thing about containment of communism and this Cold War and all. And Nehru at that point makes an interesting observation. He says, look, our crusade doesn't fit in with this communism and anti-communism. And in that context, he was also addressing this question of Chinese expansion. And he said, look, if China has to be expansionist, communist or not communist, it will be expansionist. So he took it out of that divide, and he addressed this question of China's behavior, perfidious, as Patel put it. So that was one dimension. And now, on the other side, you also have this tension between nationalism and internationalism. These are two very strong kind of dimensions which we see over and over again in Nehru's speeches, his writings, because here again we will see that idealism and realism really does not satisfactorily address this issue. And I think you brought that out very rightly. Again, he mentions to a group of journalists who are going to Southeast Asia, and I think it was Moraes who was leading that delegation, and he said that remember that the India-China competition runs across the spine of Southeast Asia. So he's very clear that there is this, but we have, I think, brought out all the dynamics which were acting in unison, the domestic, the international, the regional. I think the final point I would bring in here is about Nehru's vision of Asia. And that's something that is repeated very often in many contexts today. Bandung, that was the first unveiling, which backfired in one sense because Zhou Enlai didn't like how Nehru was patronizing him. But the fact is that he clearly saw that unless China and India worked in tandem in a cooperative framework, there would be no Asia. And so, irrespective of how he understood the China challenge, despite the fact that there was blowback from domestic parties about recognizing China, or at least pushing China's case, he was looking at a larger perspective. And I think somewhere on balance, we have to see whether it worked out well for India or not. So those are just some things I'd like to put on the table. Thank you, but really fascinating. I think we need to revisit this more.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Over to the chair. You're muted, Atul.
Other questions are there?
No, sir. There are now more questions. Yeah.
Dr. Professor Roy, if you want to add something more to it.
No, I think, I mean, it always helps to have these discussions because I completely agree with ma'am that some of this tendency of, pigeonholing him into this idealist or realist bracket does not really work because, I mean, I remember during my doctoral years, my doctoral work was on Nehru's foreign policy. And I mean, as a student of IR, you're always, trying to get a theoretical hook that works well. And I mean, I remember my struggle with trying to get Nehru to fit somewhere. And I realized at the end of the day that that was not possible. Because, I mean, as she rightly pointed out, that, when he says that, the rivalry with, or the competition or whatever you want to call, with China runs right across. That makes him look like a very, sort of conventional, sort of realist sort of politician. But when you take any book or maybe even the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, any volume, and you just start reading it, one page he sounds like this very competitive, sort of, real Machiavellian sort of a, cast in that mold. 2 pages down, he sounds completely different. And it's difficult at the end of the day to really come up with any sort of, confident understanding of who he really was. So for those who have made the argument that Nehru was, let's say, an idealist, full marks to them for the confidence that they have. For those who also equally say that, Nehru was nothing but a realist, again, I would again say that, that is also a very brave sort of call to make because there is great degree of indeterminacy that is built into Nehru's own thinking. So I think as students, again, we need to sometimes be having a flexible approach to sort of, approaching it. And sometimes I think the best way is simply to let whatever we come across, the facts, the evidence, the sort of events, speak loudly for themselves rather than trying to use these sort of, frameworks that we have and trying to fit somebody as complicated as Nehru. But I'm sure there's so many other world leaders, diplomats, etc., who would also create such confusions. And I think we should allow them to speak. We should try to sort of, bring out whatever their thoughts are as lucidly as possible and then sort of hope for the best in that regard.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Thank you so much. This issue of Nehru and China policy is so very important in understanding the present policy as well. Only thing is that Nehru for us in those days, in the early years of our independence, when we were actually an infant nation, I would say, he was our hero for India. We wanted him to be a hero. He was a sort of Shah Rukh Khan for that matter, but how important was he to the outside world is something that we have to, understand basically. Shah Rukh Khan is definitely for the outside world is definitely not Tom Cruise. So therefore, and Shah Rukh Khan has, when we listen to Shah Rukh Khan, we would say that our hero basically, he talks a lot, and we look forward to his wisdom basically. But outside world does not really, bother about us. The powerful world, really, powerful world would listen to Tom Cruise more, and there are many people who would not even listen to him. So therefore, we have to keep that in perspective when we are sort of, trying to understand Nehru also. He may be our hero. He may be saying very big things. How much of it he meant, how much of agency that he had, is something that we have to weigh in whenever we are trying to evaluate Nehru for that matter. So therefore, it is very important to understand the international context in which he is playing. So even the China issue from 1955 was not a Cold War issue. Was not an issue India had. What Russia was professing on China, or what advocating on China, or what America was at. There was a clear division between Britain and America. And we were following a British policy by and large. So that distinction, unless and until it comes into the context in which we are framing our argument, is very important, because most of the time we tend to, overlook that particular factor. Or even question came up that we were telling the British to follow a particular policy. It was not like that. If you read the archival files, you will definitely get, there is an archival file on our policy on China. There's a big file existing. Even in UK, there are files. So that kind of influences, those kinds of networks, is something which I feel is important to study, to understand our policy frameworks, rather than, the kind of rhetorical statements which leaders make. And so there are pressures on every leader, even now. Imagine the pressures on Nehru in early 50s. When we have pressures even now, our Prime Minister, when India has advanced so much, India is the fourth largest economy of the world, yet there are pressures. You can't even fight a war with China, with Pakistan for that matter, if you wanted to elongate a war. It's so difficult even in the present day context. So imagine the kind of pressures on Nehru. So therefore, one has to really, and not really, Nehru made very bold statements. He wanted to have, he wanted to impact the whole world, but he was also realist in the sense that he understood the best role he could play is as a mediator. Nothing beyond that. Trying to reconcile between Britain and China, or trying to reconcile matters between China, America, and Russia, or Soviet Union. So that's the best role that he could play, and he understood it very well. So he played it politics accordingly. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. It was fascinating discussion. And as always on the ICS seminar, it is always fascinating to be here. Thank you so much, Alka. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you to ICS. Thank you, sir.
Wonderful. Highly obliged to you both. Thank you.
Thank you. Signing off. Bye-bye.
Any vote of thanks to be given?
Yes, thank you, Chair. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Dr. Nabarun Roy and Dr. Atul Bharadwaj for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's seminar shall be available on the ICSS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 11th March 2026 at 3 p.m. IST. Details about the events can be found on the ICSS website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.